Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we kind of play around with our hybrid equipment here. I believe I see a lot of familiar faces on the screen, and we've got some people here in person with us. So this is our new way of the future for doing these programs, hopefully making it a little more convenient for folks. So for those of you who I don't know, my name is Kendall. I'm one of the social workers here at the Orange County Department on Aging. And today we have Rich Gwaltney, who is from Transitions Life Care. And he is going to talk with us about sandwich generation caregiving. Okay, perfect. Someone is taking notes. Perfect. That's great. We're going to talk about sandwich generation caregiving. So folks who are caring for aging relatives as well as children in the home. So if just kind of housekeeping pieces, if anyone is having trouble with their Zoom, just put a message in the chat and feel free to put messages in the chat as well if you have questions, comments, anything like that. And I know Rich will definitely welcome any questions that come through as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rich.
All right, thank you. Welcome everybody in this first hybrid presentation. I'm going to duck down and say hello to everyone. Welcome. Glad you're here. I'm going to stand up and face you guys to the side. I do want to say this before we get started, just kind of some housekeeping things as well. Anything that you see that we share today, don't feel like you have to feverishly write any notes in that. We're going to send the PDF copy of this to Kindle if you want it. The notes from this, we'll make those available to you. So, and absolutely, I think sometimes the way I like to do these, whether it's hybrid or in person, is for us just to kind of set the table with the information that we're going to share today. And if you're online, type your questions in, or in the room or in person, just however you want to do this, write down your questions, remember your questions. And I'm just going to walk us through some basic information, some things that have been new to me to discover. This talk that we're having today is actually the first, this year is the first time we really rolled out this conversation because of the growing need. And caregivers are one of our biggest audiences that we work with. We've done so many caregiver summits and events over the years. And I love speaking with caregiver support groups. We're helping to co-launch one with another senior center right now, and just come alongside with more from an educational standpoint. But well, let me reintroduce myself so you kind of know where I'm coming from. My name is Rich Gwaltney, and I'm the community engagement representative for Transitions Life Care. If you've lived in the Triangle area for any period of time, you would know us as Hospice of Wake County. A few years back, we changed our name to better represent who we are, because we do a little more than hospice, and we also do it in more than Wake County. Hold on a second. Make sure we can advance this. Bear with me. Large screen sharing. Oh, there it is. Great. Yeah. So just briefly, I like to give a little context, kind of know where we're coming from into this conversation. Back in 1979, one of Raleigh's first oncologists started a hospice organization when he reached a place where his patients reached a place where cure was no longer an option. And he wanted to do something about it. And he joined a very fledgling movement. You know, sometimes you think hospice, you think that's been around for a very long time. And I guess long is relative, but really it's a very recent phenomenon that started in the UK in the late 60s, and in America in 1974. The first modern hospice was in Connecticut, and then 1979 we started, and we served that first year. I think we had 2 part-time nurses and had probably 6 or 7 patients. And fast forward to today, we've got over 500 employees and over 300 volunteers. And we do more than hospice, and as I mentioned, and we do it in more than Wake County. So we're in about an 8-county area, of which Orange County is one of those. I actually live in Chapel Hill. I'm about far outside of it as you can get and still be in it. So I've called it home for the last 10 or 11 years. And so we serve about an 8-county area, but the care that we offer is everything from way upstream, long before anyone would need hospice. So caregiver support, resources and referrals and trainings. home health, children's hospice and palliative care with their transitions kids, palliative care, of course, hospice care, and our grief care, which we offer to anybody who's lost a loved one, regardless of if it's cared for by a hospice or not, hospice related or not. And the reason I'd like to just give that 3 or 4 minute just platform is just kind of know a little bit of the background that we come from. Now, my background, and I shared this with some in the room earlier as we were walking in, and I'll share with all of us, is my background prior to this 10 years in this role has been in education, ministry, and spiritual care. Before I landed in Chapel Hill, my wife and our 2 kids, who are now grown, one married and one on their way out the door, we spent 5 years in Malaysia working in an international context at a school, just doing spiritual life director. My wife's an English teacher. And when we landed here, our plans didn't quite pan out. And this door opened up for us. And I had no health and medical background at the time, and just was really big on engaging the community and audiences concerning the issues that matter the most in a person's life, focused really on life and living. And that's where the idea of expanding what we do in the community went to, not just showing up to have a talk about hospice or about grief or advanced directives, all very important topics. They're kind of the bread and butter of what we talk about. But we created an expanded menu of talks like we've had plenty here in the past in the years past, and then today. And as I started by saying, when it comes to the caregiving audience, and when I first got invited, and we were planning 3 or 4 caregiver summits a year, when I first got invited to speak to my first caregiver support group or audience, what I recognized, it was just a tenderness in their heart and a receptivity because of what that caregiving journey was like for them, and the need to provide resources and hope and encouragement and support, even if it's just that one transactional meeting. And I was on a short-term caregiving journey after my wife had a car accident a few years ago and broke 2 bones in her back. And all of a sudden being thrust into that, I was starting to get exposed to a number of resources I didn't think I'd have to tap into quite then. And it actually kind of spurred on a lot of these conversations about caregiving and caregiving resources. We do a conversation on encouraging the heart of a caregiver, trying to help caregivers find strategies for finding rest in and from their journey as a caregiver, as well as some other ones. And I put that to put the context of today's talk into place because as I was talking to my supervisor and people on our team about content that we see coming, that's important for us to talk about. Immediately, the title of the caregiver, the sandwich generation caregiver, came to mind. And burning the candle at both ends actually describes what that journey is like. We're going to really unpack a little bit about what we mean by sandwich generation caregiver, but in general, and we'll get more specific, a little bit deeper dive. What we're looking at is a generation of caregivers who are, and again, we'll see the split here in a minute, but they typically have a loved one they're caring for, a parent or a grandparent, but they also have children in the home as well, and children up through high school, college, people who are still living at home, but also in many cases juggling a career. And if anybody is on a caregiving journey and you know what that's like, it is a full-time job. And then the issues that come up both with work and that work-life balance, that's really what we're looking at today. Today is actually probably a little headier than most talks that I have. I usually go more heartier from the heart standpoint. And the reason I say that is it's based on a recent study that was had not too long ago. So here's a little bit of the table of contents, so to say, what we're going to walk through. Based on a study from the National Alliance on Caregiving and Caring Across Generations, we're going to take a look at just some key facts, just the basic findings, some policy recommendations. And that sounds like, okay, I thought somebody's going to help me in my caregiving journey. I actually, when I shared this with a caregiving support group, not just a week ago, actually those policy recommendations started to open people's eyes to say, there are things that could make my caregiving journey easier. because not all caregivers are, I don't want to say this is stereotypical, but as we age, as our spouse ages, as one of our health, our health begins to fail, or we find ourselves caring for a parent, we typically look at that as the typical caregiving role. But when you start to throw some of these other factors in, and then how, as a community, we're joking in the room here a little bit about some of our students and interns that are here with us today, and just talking about, as you well know, demographically, if you're working with seniors and aging population, which we're a part of, the baby boomer population, there's going to be a lot of need in the area of caring for, and that's why we're here in the senior center and online as well. And the reason I say that is that it's a need that's not going away. This need for caring, the high cost of health care, the high cost of finding a place to live, an assisted living facility, even having in-home care. So when you start to think about that, and then the caregiver's journey, the unpaid hours that a full-time or a part-time or a personal caregiver gives, it's just those policy recommendations will make a little more sense. And then we'll close with just an example of some local resources, many you'll know of, but more just to open your eyes. Because what I often say when people are on a caregiving journey is, you don't know what you need to know until you need to know it. It's like, I don't know that I needed a bed. I didn't know that I could have someone come into my house and help me do this, or I didn't know what adult daycare was, or and you just don't think of those things until you have to. But if it's in a crisis situation and something happens and you're thrust into the role of a caregiver, you want and need supports. And that's where I think we're going to wrap this up. We're going to have plenty of time as well for questions. So if you type your questions in online, we will methodically go through them and answer the best we can. Whatever we can't answer in the room or online, we will find answers for you if there's something specific that you need. Well, this demographic actually is a great portrait of what a sandwich caregiver looks like. And again, some of the organizations that help put this study together on burning the candle at both ends. So of all of the caregivers in America, 11 million of them are considered sandwich caregivers. So how does that break down? 61% of those are female, 39% of those male. Average age of a sandwich generation caregiver is 41 years old. 67% of that 11 million are employed. And we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges there. 31% are millennials. 49% are Gen X. 7% Asian Pacific Islander, 22% Hispanic, 53% non-Hispanic white, and 16% non-Hispanic Black. So when you think about the demographics of our country and you think about the breakdown generationally and practically, you're starting to see generationally, and we'll dive a little deeper into this, that Gen X, kind of more my generation, is rapidly growing, 49% of those who are sandwich caregivers, but the phenomenon too of millennials who are in caregiving roles. There's a reverse side of this. You see when people are aging and their grandkids need care, and it's the grandparents that are caring for grandkids. Now you're almost seeing with this sandwich generation caregiving, you're seeing millennials right out of college and graduate school into the workplace, living closer to someone who needs care. And that's really the nature of this conversation. There are, if you're here and listening to this and you're thinking, well, I don't think I fit into this, there are applications to this study for you, as well as some resources and some definite reminders. So key findings from the study, as we mentioned, about 11 million, 28% of all caregivers provide unpaid care to an adult while also caring for children living in their home. So we refer to this group, as we've mentioned, this subgroup of caregivers as sandwich caregivers. And living at home doesn't have to be little children. Literally, someone said, my son's graduating, he's walking this Sunday or Saturday, and then I'm no longer a sandwich caregiver because they're leaving. So anyone who's got that situation. The distinctive characteristic of sandwich caregivers, they are more ethnically diverse. They're younger and newer to caregiving. Again, you can look at this from a different generational perspective, even as I read these, but you can think through how for generations, we didn't really categorize caregivers. We categorize this as what families do for each other when people get sick. And living overseas in Malaysia for the 5 years I was there, people from all over the world doing life together on this tiny little turtle-shaped island in Southeast Asia, from all walks and all religions and just all languages. But to see how they cared for each other, how they went through just life's phases and seasons and stages. I remember coming back to the US and people were talking, there was a conversation between a friend of mine who was an Asian American, second generation, and an American, and they were talking about everything from hospice care to home health and having caregivers come in. And a friend who was Asian American said, well, we really don't use a lot of those resources. And the American was, his response was like, well, what do you do? And it's like, we just take care of our family. And that's what we do. And that's kind of an interesting illustration, but it doesn't matter what culture you're from. There comes a point where you're out of your depth. There comes a point where it becomes too much. Now, the support of a family, a culture, a faith community, a senior center, an extended family, virtual sometimes even. We learned that during COVID. If there's any gift COVID gave us, it made us become both high tech and high touch at the same time. It's a matter of what we do when we're online. How do we connect? And for some people, that was just connecting with grandparents or parents when I can't get there, to know that I had the technology to just pick up. If it wasn't just a phone, I could use the technology to do it. So when we say younger and newer to caregiving, I doubt you graduate from college or from graduate school, or you're entering into your first job and you're in the first season of your professional life. You're not thinking on your timeline, I'm supposed to be taking care of my grandmother at this time, or my mother, right? And I'm starting a family. I'm thinking about a toddler right now. I'm not thinking about it. So that's what we mean by newer to it, is that we didn't entertain these things. But as the culture's changed and grown, obviously the need's there. But the same, just to go back to that cultural illustration, the same heartbeats in all those cultures. We want to take care of our own. But we're going to see some interesting parts about this generation of caregivers that's unique. At an average age of 41, these caregivers are about 12 years younger than their care receivers or other caregivers without children at home, and are often from the Gen X and millennial generations, which we mentioned. Care teams and tasks, sandwich caregivers, and again, these are all direct findings from this report and study, are often part of a care team. About half of the sandwich generation caregivers report having help from other unpaid caregivers, 53% of them. And 1 in 4 report receiving help from paid aides or services in order to care for their adult care recipient. So that's like that practical application of that story I was sharing with you, is that sometimes we just, and I'm not trying to stereotype a generation or a subgroup of people, but sometimes the older you get and you're one of 2 siblings, you start thinking, this responsibility is falling on me. I have to do this. And caregivers burn out when they realize they can't do it all by themselves. But then they feel that caregiver guilt of thinking, but I'm supposed to be able. She took care of me when I was little and I was needy, or even as a young adult. Why? It's like I should have that same wherewithal. But you see a generation of caregivers where in the past, and again, not trying to stereotype or make it push it into this study, where maybe an older caregiver saying, I'm going to go it alone until I can't. Younger generation caregivers are like, I wasn't really prepared for this. Who's out there to help me? What resources are out there where I can get help in home as well as for myself? Sandwich caregivers help their care recipient with instrumental activities of daily living and other activities of daily living, or more complex and even skilled medical nursing tasks. Now imagine that you're in your mid 30s to 40. And again, I joked with you earlier, I had no health and medical background before I entered into this. I just have a much older group of students now. It's typically my age and up, as I joked about earlier. But imagine if you're thrust into this and you don't have a medical background. Maybe you're comfortable caring for others, but all of a sudden you're getting called on that clinicians are teaching you that while we're not here, you may need to change this. You may need to do this. You may need to administer medication. Some of that sounds very simple, but you're talking about, it could be everything from very basic. I just need to help my loved one get from the bed to change to the shower to back. That's hard enough, but some of it can become very complex. And again, so back to the point of, if we're helping on all these levels, even basic training and resources, how do I get my grandfather out of bed and change the bed, right? Like, how do I do that task if he weighs 85 pounds more than you, right? So there are actually trainings and things that we've done in the past to help caregivers and our support resources for that. But sometimes you overlook those, right? And you just think, oh, well, that's, yeah, okay, you change, you go shower and we'll be fine. And it's like, they need help. And it's like, well, how do we do that? So a lot of that could be the basic things and feeding to the more complex. Types of tasks sandwich caregivers most commonly help with. Transportation, obviously, is a big one. Housework. If anybody has ever been short or long-term in a caregiving journey, one of the first things that goes is the cleanliness and orderliness of your house, because first things first. The only thing that matters as you triage and try to sort out what's important at home. You want cleanliness, but it's like that pile of laundry is going to sit there for a while because the most important thing is your loved one. So, but tasks like housework, preparing meals or bringing meals, very few, though, as we mentioned, for these skilled needs, are prepared to do the medical and nursing tasks. Some are more predisposed. Some might find a new calling while doing it. You never can tell. So not afraid to ask for help, but also join or have a care team join them. We mentioned this earlier, work-life balance. That gets a lot of play in every work circles, right? Because your employers don't want you to burn out, but caregiver burnout is real. So when we think about how do we apply this to our own work-life balance, and again, if you're a caregiver in the sandwich generation, now you're looking at, I have true work-life balance, and then I have to work-life balance my caregiver life. And that's where I'm not plugging it to do the talk. I'm plugging the idea to you that this whole concept of creating a strategy for yourself to find rest, because you're going to not only rest from your work, you're going to work from the place of your rest. So if you're not doing self-care in that work-life balance, it's not just saying, I'm going to take a day off today and I'm going to go have some me time. That's important. And that is part of the balance, but it's very intentionally ceasing from everything that's necessary, that stresses you, and embracing things that give life. The people, the places, the green pastures, the still waters. You live in North Carolina, 3 hours one way, you're in the mountains, 3 hours the other way, you're on the beach. And everywhere in between is beautiful too. But wherever that place, those people are, to where you find you get recharged, that you can come now and work from the place of that rest, but to guard it and then not feel bad if you're taking it. And that's where that caregiver guilt can really eat us up, right? It's like, well, they're not really getting much rest. They're in pain or they're needy. I can do this. I'm gonna keep going until I burn out or rust out. So these sandwich caregivers are often juggling work responsibilities in addition to caring for both an adult and a child. They report dedicating on average 22 hours per week to caring for their loved ones. Just do the math on that with your work week. If you're working 40-ish plus hours, imagine squeezing in another 22 unpaid, but probably a lot more strenuous than your day job when you think about it. So where you go back to work and you're like, finally, I get a break when I go back to work. And that's what a lot of sandwich generation caregivers would report. But think about that, 22 hours per week, and you multiply that by that 11 million caregivers of just this generation. Imagine how much of a workforce that is and how much money that's saving, or the family, the individual, but also that stress on the healthcare industry and on the helping healthcare industry. We do a radio talk show on WPTF called Aging Matters. And I remember once a few years ago, I did one session and then on a topic, but a gentleman who's been in the caregiver field, like training CNAs and putting people in the homes, he started to talk about the need to up the pay and elevate the status of personal or professional caregivers that would assist you. And the reason why is if you're paying these CNAs $12, $13, $14 an hour, which is not bad if you're just kind of working your way through and putting in a couple hours, but Amazon starting you at $18 to $22 to $25 an hour. The need, as we mentioned earlier, is not going away for caregivers, regardless of age. So when it comes to these additional supports that are going to help us, it's important for us to be a part of that greater conversation. One of those is sandwich caregivers often lack workplace benefits. Now you're starting to see that change, because a lot of organizations, large and small, when we talk about work-life balance, we start talking about wellness programs, or we start talking about employee assistant programs where when you're getting, pulled, I can't tell you, ours is such a wonderful organization and how we've done ours. And some we go outside the organization, but every time a crisis is hit in the culture or practically in person's life, the reminders and the care and having that in an organization or a school is so important. But when you start thinking about what are the benefits that could really help you, is that extended paid leave. Maybe on the front end of a caregiving journey, it's like, this is taking more than I thought. I need to adjust my life, my schedule, my children, how I get them to school, how I get them home. And again, I hate giving COVID a lot of credit, but another small gift we received from going through this was a lot of people's ability, organizations, to realize that we can actually get a lot of work done from home. And in that case, think how that's benefited both parents, caregivers, or both in that sandwich caregiving. So, but at times paid leave, that might help them manage responsibilities. As a result, if there's not paid leave or there's not those assistants, especially seasonally as we transition into these journeys, we miss work, we cut down our work hours during the prime working time in these years when we're really trying to be long-term saving at a younger age when we're entering into the workforce. So 1 in 5 sandwich caregivers report feeling financial strain as a result of being a caregiver. It is going to take its physical toll, but it's going to take a financial toll as well. Things do cost money. And while insurance will cover a lot of things, it doesn't always cover everything that's needed. Not surprisingly, roughly a third of sandwich caregivers report a high level of emotional stress, and a fifth of these report a high level of financial and physical strain. I actually have someone in my family who was caring for, my grandfather was caring for my grandmother. Not a sandwich generation, but, and you see this in some people's situations that are very stressful financially, emotionally, and physically, is that my grandfather was in pretty good health. And actually he passed away before my grandmother, who was very ill because of the stress and the strain, and he had a heart attack and it just compiled on him. And so again, burnout is real, and the caregiver burnout on your journey is real. Among these sandwich caregivers, those co-residing with their care recipients and those caring for a close relative are most likely reported to high strain. Imagine how stressful it is just having a roommate sometimes. Imagine if your roommates were your spouse, okay, you've already accustomed to that. A grandparent that you're caring for who's ill, 2 children who are of various ages who have lives and ball games and school and doctor's appointments, and then you trying to maintain your own life. So when that starts to happen in this sandwich caregiving generation, you can start to see, because again, we highlighted earlier when we talked some about these policies here in a second, the recommendations from this study is when you think about the high cost of finding a place for someone to live and be cared for. And sometimes there's just a tipping point because it's just not safe to keep someone in your home. But even then, sometimes options can be limited, and that causes more financial strain. And because of that, we see a whole movement, as you guys know today, about aging in place, whole construction services that I got exposed to 10 years ago when I first started, and I started to realize there's a whole industry, that is devoted to the idea of let's retrofit. If your house is your forever home and you want to stay here and you're probably going to need care or going to need to give it, let's widen those doors. Let's widen, let's ramps on the way in. Let's make sure we have all we need in the house to get in and out of a tub. Not trying to make it look like a medical facility, but just to say, let's make those adjustments, because a small investment now on wider doors and things like that in the long run could actually save money for you. So just something to think about on that work-life balance. Resources and training. As we mentioned, or I alluded to earlier, the younger sandwich generation caregivers were reported to be more likely to receive preparation than older non-sandwich caregivers, perhaps because of their newer tenure as caregivers, or because they grew up in an era where information has always been accessible, often at their fingertips. I can't tell you how many times I've been at a table at an expo or health fair, or caregivers or not, and someone from another city would be there. That was at an Alzheimer's walk at the Durham Bulls Stadium years ago. And I remember talking to them about resources, and they lived in South Florida, South Miami, where I'd lived for a period of time. And I didn't know people down there because that wasn't my field at that time. But I recognized that everything that I know of here exists down there, but maybe under a different name. And it really started to open up my eyes to say, and even helping a high school friend, a girl that I grew up with, whose mother she just got into a caregiving role with her mom, and she is a sandwich generation caregiver. It just hit me. And to get online for her, knowing where she lived, where I grew up, to say, this looks like a reputable company. But you see some people, again, I'm not saying it's just generational, may just put that off and say, look, we got this. We'll just do the best we can for as long as we can. Where a younger generational approach, which we can learn from an older generation, is it's okay and it's not a weakness to call out for help. And there are people, even if it's a one-time, let me come in and tell you how to make your house safe. Let me come in and tell you, we go through a 6-hour training of here's how you can lift your loved one out of bed. Occupational therapist. When my wife had her accident, learning how to get her up out of bed. And I was used to that because gone through a few surgeries and some other things in the past. But there were definitely some things particular to the diagnosis and the circumstances I needed to know. So sometimes it's just that 1 or 2 appointments with an occupational therapist to say, this is how we're going to move, and this is how there's types of things you can do with them. So when you're there as a sandwich generation caregiver and you're finding out, here are the exercises, here's what you have to make sure happens and doesn't happen. So, but you have a generation that's not afraid to ask for help. 85% of sandwich caregivers report needing more information on at least one caregiving related topic, including managing stress. I think I've talked a lot about stress, so I don't want to add any more to that. About 25% of them said it was difficult to find affordable services for their care recipient. And that is just the nature of healthcare, but there may be options. One of the resources that we've offered historically is a referral resource of vetted resources that, and they're not just partners and friends of ours, but they're vetted in the sense that from a qualitative standpoint, but also we actually refer people on that list to things that we do as well. We want to find the best resource for that person, because again, your diagnosis will change your caregiving journey. The scenery, if your loved one has Alzheimer's dementia versus ALS, or a cancer journey, or a sudden heart attack and a recovery, or a stroke, no 2 caregiving journeys are exactly alike. So you're going to see a lot of different issues. And that's where calling out to diagnosis specific groups in the community. And I remember one time I was here and we were working with a Parkinson's group and a support group. And again, when you start to work with these diagnosis-specific groups, Parkinson's, ALS, and dementia, you start to get around other caregivers for support who you might not think, if you're a sandwich generation caregiver, that you've got the time to zip in and out for a support group midday or at night. But those can be the most impactful resources, talking about managing stress, knowing you're not alone, knowing that what you're feeling, both positive and your negative outbursts or things that come out of you that you didn't think were going to happen, knowing that other people, that's par for the course, and that's part of that caregiving journey. So finding those affordable services, the resources and referrals that we try to help people are just finding them in their area. It's a number you can just simply call in and or go to the website and we can help with that. And if we don't do it, which we don't do everything on that list, we know people who we would refer you to that could definitely help you. The last point I wanted to add into this is the idea of rural caregiving. Rural caregivers, and this is straight from the report, were more likely to report that their care recipients lived in their own home. 66%, or alone was 35. So you think about, we're trying to avoid all the stereotypes, but we work in a lot of rural counties, and my family grew up in rural counties, and maybe you did too, but you can tell that's kind of just like that conversation between my Asian American friend and also the purely Westerner who's talking about how to care for their loved ones. It's a very similar approach in the rural settings, right? We just take care of our own. And families usually stay a little closer. And now some move away and some come back and some stay. But there's community, there's church, there's other faith communities, there's supports, there's folks who know you. And that's why, so more likely to be taken into their home or to stay alone as long as they can in their own homes. Rural caregivers living and caring in rural areas find themselves, though, with fewer supports or services like transportation, respite care for the caregiver, meaning responsibility for performing these services falls primarily on the caregiver. It doesn't mean that they're not in rural settings. They're just not as plenteous as they were here. I know for us, and I've seen this with other caregivers. I mean, when I needed a bed for my wife, the bed was there in 12 hours, and I didn't even believe it was going to happen. When I needed an occupational therapist, they were there the next morning, and they were there the next 3 days to make sure everything was okay. So sometimes the proximity to, to a city or to an urban setting or college town that has, a very robust medical system, when you get farther out, you start seeing that becoming more and more difficult. But I think it's worth mentioning just to know that part of that challenge is real. Remember I said apologetically, which is not a political talk about, but based on this study, some of the policy recommendations, some we already talked about or referred, things that could improve and that should improve to address needed improvements in our long-term care system. You've got everything from long-term healthcare insurance to what are the parts of the systems, affordability even in long-term care, providing paid family and medical leave across the lifespan. I mean, you do see that growing, so that's probably not something new. But when you think about maternity and paternity leaves, when you talk about the whole lifespan and needing to take time, but also to make sure it's crossing the whole lifespan, because sometimes it's funny how we treat children different than we treat those of us when we get older, right? We shouldn't, but we do. We think this is the most vulnerable. And the things that we expect out of a child when they happen when someone's older kind of appall you at times. It's like, well, we don't think for once that if a baby messes their diaper or needs help feeding or needs help moving around or getting places, that's just cute. That's what babies do. And it's the same, though, on the opposite end of our lifespan. And the reason I share that, not just tongue in cheek as a story, but it should find its way as well into how we care for the worker in the workplace who's on both ends of that care. But imagine if you're on both ends at the same time. Hence the name of the study, burning the candle at both ends. Provide family caregiver tax credits. Again, I won't go into what that looks like, but the study itself goes into greater detail. How can you make more of your expenses as a caregiver, even time missed as well? How can you get tax credit for that? Increasing access to affordable, quality childcare and early learning options. Imagine if, again, no two sandwich caregivers are going to be exactly the same, depending on their work situation, age of their children. But you wouldn't think advocating for quality, affordable childcare and early learning options would affect, except if you're a sandwich caregiver. Increase the use and standardized caregiver assessment tools. How do we assess the needs that caregivers have? And there's also conversation concerning Social Security Caregiver Credit Act. And again, I won't get us too far out of the scope of that. My last point, and then we'll open this up for conversation. And some of this we talked about, when you say team usually has a very clinical, a clinical application to it. You start thinking about certain doctors and nurses and specialists. But when we talk about it as caregiver, as a caregiver, and this is true whether you're a sandwich caregiver or not, or you're any caregiving journey, we need to look at who's on our care team. If we learn from this study that generationally an older generation's a little less apt to ask for help, let's learn from that research and as well as on the younger side as well. How do we create a care team? The number one thing I like to encourage caregivers is not only to create a care team, but to let people know that they're on yours. And sometimes for friends and family, it's not necessarily, I need you to give me a break. That's important. But sometimes it's that old friend across the nation or down the street who's not going to come help change a bed or do something, but to say, I just need you to check on me. I need you to call me. Can we make sure we do that walk every morning? Those are my life-giving moments where I recharge. So it could, so when I say family and friends, sometimes we just think task at hand, I need financial help, I need this, that, and the other. Sometimes it's, it is, can you sit with mom so I can just go and my kids, give me a date night, give me a help, somehow. Professional caregivers, obviously, who are those people that we can invite into our home that are going to help? Home health options, adult daycare, outside the home, just knowing that there are other places. Community groups, we're sitting in one right now, just knowing whether it's a support group or whether it's a senior center or a place like Seymour, is knowing that there are greater supports here. And again, if we opened up what all those were now, we'd have another probably hour of conversation. In faith communities, if you're a part of a faith community or you're ready to join one again, sometimes when life happens to us, we start to find too, because some people have said, well, are you sure you want to talk about faith communities and this, that? I'm like, yes, and here's why. Regardless of the faith, no one's better equipped and already prepared to turn themselves outward and inward to both care for their congregation, but also their community. And we see that in volunteers we have at hospice, some who just come and do just regular tasks, car maintenance, dropping off meals, cutting grass, things like that, to actual caregiver support. And a lot of them are hosted. There's a great church in downtown Durham that's had a caregiver support group going on for years, so much so that the caregivers talk about tours of duty that they've taken as a caregiver. And I remember asking this one lady, and I always tell her story when I'm with caregivers. She said she's taken care of 3 people from the moment they were ill to when they passed. And I said, well, what brings you? She said, I'm not caring for anyone right now. And I said, well, what brought you to this group today? And she said, I'm here to encourage these people around this table who are on a caregiving journey. So when we talk about faith communities, community groups, your friends and family, letting them know, I need you. I don't need you to take it all from me, right? You can't take it off my shoulder. To quote The Hobbit, right? I can, or Lord of the Rings, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you. There's times the ring falls to you as a caregiver. In some cases, you are the only one who can do certain things for people. But there are times you need somebody to carry you. we all need a Sam as well as Fred, right? So it's important to have that support and let folks know that they are on our support team. Again, I won't read through all these other than to draw your attention to places like AARP. They're prepared to care. Actually, we took part of that, and it kind of inspired a talk that we do on navigating the caregiving journey. Great resource. They're always on the cutting edge of issues, but especially on caregiving. The Caregiver Action Network, National Alliance of Caregiving, and then our website's there, or you can call in directly and just talk about caregiver supports that you might need. So, all right. Well, I know that was a lot like drinking from the fire hydrant. How are we doing on time here?
We're good.
We're right there.
Good, yeah.
Do you want to look at, or you want me to look at, I guess where I want to leave this time-wise, which time is it? I don't see our time. Oh, I see right there.
Yeah.
So we just want to make sure, and we'll check the chat feature to see if there's any questions. But if there's not questions, maybe what starts the conversation well is, was there something that resonated with you or that was helpful for you today? And it doesn't have to be one of anything, and you don't do anything, but is there something that maybe stuck out to you that maybe was something you learned or got that you didn't see?
And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Oh, yeah.
So folks,
Good.
welcome
Good
to speak freely without fear of living on the internet forever. But for
Good
those
idea.
watching the recording, thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.